So, think about the sheer variety of ancient cultures across the globe,
Mm.
separated by time and space. Yet, so many of them practiced mummification. It's a truly enduring mystery.
Well, yeah, and it's like what drove this widespread phenomenon. On this deep dive, we're tackling that question by looking at a very unique piece of material.
That's right. You brought to the table the transcript of a YouTube video, right? Documenting a hypnotherapy session that zeroes in on the subject of mummification.
Exactly. Now, it's important for you listening to understand that this isn't, a scientifically validated study. Our goal isn't really to prove or disprove the experiences shared in this session.
Right.
Instead, we're going to explore it as a fascinating perspective, particular set of beliefs surrounding this age-old practice.
Exactly. Consider it a journey into a unique narrative, a different way of looking at a well-documented historical event. And this session touches on so many intriguing angles, from what are perceived as the earliest instances of artificial mummification, all the way to its potential connections to, like, the metaphysical realm.
Yeah.
For you, our listener, who we know is always eager to learn, we'll guide you through the key ideas without getting bogged down in overly complex details. Okay, let's unpack this. According to this perspective, where did artificial mummification first come about?
Well, what's compelling here is how the subject, Álvaro, describes this ancient practice as a blend of, what we might think of as traditional methods alongside surprisingly advanced technology. He speaks of older individuals using oily substances in embalming, but also envisions a laboratory setting with sophisticated equipment. Interestingly, this involved preserving both human bodies, particularly children, and animals.
Children and animals, that's a specific detail. What was the perceived fate of these mummified beings?
Okay, so they were placed inside capsules, and here's where it gets really interesting. These capsules were then moved through what he terms a dimensional tube.
A dimensional tube.
Yeah, to a laboratory in another dimension. There, other beings were said to conduct biological research on them.
Beings from another dimension? Okay, this is certainly a novel angle. Kind of wild, actually. What kind of research were they supposedly undertaking?
The perceived aims were twofold. First, to have a readily accessible source of biological material for studies at a cellular level.
Okay.
Second, there was a focus on understanding human evolution and the possibility of hybridization. So almost like an interdimensional bioresearch project, basically.
Yeah, fascinating. And was there any perceived motivation beyond purely scientific inquiry?
Yes, Álvaro also sensed a strong intentional energy linked to the concept of immortality. It wasn't just about studying life, it was connected to a desire to demonstrate that the physical body could persist.
Even after death?
Exactly, even after death. This led to rituals where the deceased were treated as if they were still alive, which Álvaro himself found rather macabre.
Treating the dead as if they were still living. That's a striking image. Was there any perceived underlying cause for this powerful desire for physical terminance?
The subject strongly connects this to a specific area within the brain, identifying it as a fundamental human yearning for physical immortality.
Right, so that's the perceived origin according to the source.
Yeah.
Now let's shift our focus. Why did so many distinct ancient civilizations, geographically and culturally separated, all seem to arrive at the practice of mummification? What's the fundamental driving force behind this from this viewpoint?
Well, the answer Álvaro provides consistently is a desire for immortality and non-loss.
Immortality and non-loss.
Yeah. He perceives this as a deeply ingrained human characteristic, again linking it to a specific brain region very close to the pineal gland. He describes the sensation of loss as profoundly painful and frustrating for human beings. It's interesting how Álvaro's perception of a deep-seated fear of loss echoes some anthropological theories about early death rituals, though his explanation diverges significantly in its specifics, obviously.
So mummification, in this view, was a way to deal with that pain of loss, right?
Precisely. The idea is that by preserving the physical body, the tangible representation of the person who has passed it lessens the feeling of loss. It creates a kind of placebo effect, as Álvaro puts it.
The placebo effect.
Where the living can still see the deceased and feel a sense of their continued presence. This is seen as a recurring theme throughout human history, apparently.
And this feeling of loss in that specific brain area was described as quite intense, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Álvaro even reported experiencing a physical sensation, a cold headache, a pressure at the back of his head simply from discussing and identifying this brain region associated with loss.
Wow.
He also noted an increase in his breathing, indicating, the sensitivity of this area.
Beyond just individual grief,
Where?
were there any other perceived motivations for the widespread adoption of mummification?
Absolutely. The subject also suggests that mummification served as a tool for manipulating ancestral connections.
Manipulating them? How so?
By visually preserving the bodies of ancestors, it reinforced the idea of their continued presence and the transmission of their genetic lineage to future generations. It was a way of saying, look, here is your grandfather, his physical form remains, and his heritage flows through you. However, this is also framed within the narrative as a form of manipulation, reinforcing specific family or societal legacies.
Interesting a way to both comfort the bereaved and, well, reinforce social structures. Now, let's delve into some of the more esoteric aspects presented in this session. What about the subliminal or energetic side of mummification, according to this perspective?
Okay.
What happens to a person's essence? And when Álvaro uses the term essence within this session, it seems to refer to a non-physical aspect of an individual that persists after death when they undergo artificial versus natural mummification.
Right. Well, what's fascinating here is the perceived difference in the disincarnation process, the separation of this essence from the physical body. In artificial embalming, this process is seen as significantly slower, with the connection between the essence and the body lingering for a much longer time, potentially even years. Álvaro uses the analogy of it being relentless or making the disconnection sluggish.
Sluggish.
Yeah. He notes that fire, in contrast, is perceived as accelerating this release.
So artificial preservation creates a kind of energetic sticking point between the essence and the physical form.
That's the perception within this narrative. The artificial process is described as creating an adhesive between them. Conversely, in natural mummification, the disincarnation is perceived as happening more swiftly.
Faster, right?
The essence understands the death process more readily, there's no perceived sticky trace, and the essence is freer to follow its own processes, including the potential for reincarnation.
It sounds like the method of preservation has a profound impact on the energetic freedom of the departed, according to this viewpoint. This leads us to the connection between mummification and reincarnation. What's the perceived link?
The subject repeatedly emphasizes that artificial mummification, by impeding the essence's release from the body, is perceived as potentially driving the generation or the necessity of new essences, meaning new human beings, on the planet.
Huh.
The logic is that if essences are trapped with embalmed bodies, they cannot readily reincarnate, potentially creating a need for new souls to enter the cycle.
So it's like a bottleneck in the cycle of reincarnation.
That's the idea presented. While Álvaro acknowledges that some essences connected to artificially embalmed bodies might eventually reincarnate, the perception is that the majority remain connected for a very long time, thus hindering the natural cycle.
Okay.
He even provides a stark comparison, suggesting that reincarnation is affected by artificial mummification by a staggering 95–98%.
Wow, 95 to 98%.
Compared to a much lower 8–10% with natural mummification.
Those are dramatic percentages. Now let's focus on the ancient Egyptians, perhaps the civilization most famously associated with mummification. What was supposedly happening on the metaphysical plane during their mummification practices?
Okay, so according to Álvaro's perception, the Egyptians were actively trapping essences, not allowing them to fully detach from the physical body.
Trapping them.
Yes. These lingering essences were then kept captive in service to the community and particularly the rulers. So in this view, it wasn't just about honoring the dead, there was a perceived element of control involved.
Captive in service. That sounds rather controlling, as you say.
That's the implication within this narrative, yeah.
Right.
The idea is that you had not only the living individuals with their essences, but also a vast number of mummified bodies with their attached essences, all contributing to the civilization's overall energetic density.
Right.
Because this practice was more prevalent among those in positions of leadership or with specific skills, it's described as creating a very dense energy within the society, characterized as uncomfortable, heavy, and trapped.
So a civilization energetically weighed down by its deceased. Now, one of the most distinctive aspects of Egyptian mummification was the removal and discarding of the brain while the heart was preserved. What's the metaphysical explanation for this choice in this viewpoint?
The subject perceives that the Egyptians believed the brain to be a primary exit point for the essence leaving the body, specifically a zone of the head.
An exit point.
By removing the brain, they were essentially blocking this exit door, trapping the essence within the remaining body. So in this view, the removal of the brain wasn't about its perceived function in life, but rather its role in the departure of the essence after death.
So the brain was seen as the escape route for the essence.
That's the perception within this account. Furthermore, there's a perceived notion that the Egyptians considered the brain an independent organ, almost the owner or commander of the physical body.
The owner.
Removing it left the body without its owner, making it easier to keep the essence tethered. Álvaro also connects this to a common human belief of equating the self with the mind.
Interesting. So removing the brain was a way to prevent the driver from leaving the vehicle, so to speak, thus trapping the essence. Now, the section transcript also delves into some free exploration, touching on ancient laboratories and even modern practices. What were some of the key perceptions in this area?
Well, the technologically advanced laboratory that Álvaro perceived earlier is seen as existing across multiple timelines, influencing our own and other planes of existence.
Multiple timelines.
Yeah. It's not just a relic of the past, but is perceived as predating the first civilizations and continuing even into the present day. So it's an ongoing influence, according to this view.
Influencing our timeline. How so?
The specific details are somewhat vague, but the implication is that this continuous research and manipulation have had an ongoing impact on our reality. He then draws a connection between this ancient desire to preserve bodies and modern practices like those in, say, the Vatican, U.S. funeral homes, and the preservation of the bodies of celebrities. The underlying motivation in this perspective is seen as the same, to conserve the physical body and delay the separation of the essence.
So even modern embalming practices have echoes of this ancient desire to hold on to the physical form.
That's the perceived link within this narrative. Álvaro even suggests that a significant percentage, around 85% of currently active mummifications, which could include these modern preserved bodies, still retain traces of the essence connected to them.
85%. That's a startling thought. Now, the session then shifts to a specific and quite dramatic case, the Peruvian mummies in what's described as a public wine cellar type location near Lima. Tell us about that.
Yes, Álvaro perceives approximately 180 mummies in this location. Of these, around 160 are seen as having some lingering essence, but 3 stand out as having a particularly strong connection.
160 with some essence. And who are these 3 individuals with the strong connection?
These 3 are identified as a white English woman, described as a leader or like a princess, and her 2 daughters, who are perceived as having mixed indigenous and white heritage.
A family with mixed heritage. What was their story, according to this session?
Well, this is where the narrative becomes quite dramatic. Álvaro perceives a reptilian entity behind the mummies, physically described as similar to a caiman in a lake.
A reptilian entity?
Yeah, this entity is said to care for these 3 mummies, essentially feeding on their lingering essence. The woman's indigenous leader husband was reportedly murdered, and his body was never found, possibly having disintegrated.
Horrible. And what led to the mummification of the woman and her daughters? Was it their choice?
No, that's the key point. The tribal council, according to this perception, decided to sacrifice and mummify the woman and her daughters who, notably, did not consent as an honorific act to preserve their powerful reign.
An honorific act, but without consent.
Right. However, it's also perceived as a way to sever their direct lineage due to concerns about their mixed heritage and the woman's perceived white magic. So, a complex mix of honoring and control seems to be at play in this account.
So, a complex mix of honoring and controlling. And the mummification process itself, was it similar to the Egyptian methods we discussed earlier?
Not entirely. Álvaro perceives the use of toxins derived from spiny, milky jungle plants that caused a drying effect,
Jungle plants.
along with large amounts of salt and a different kind of oil one that was non-vegetal. Compression was also employed, and the stronger connection of essence to these 3 individuals compared to the others is attributed specifically to their non-consensual sacrifice.
That lack of consent appears to be a significant factor in this particular case, according to this perspective. The session then takes a fascinating turn with a communication established with the essence of this white woman. Tell us about that exchange.
Yeah, the hypnotherapist, Elena, facilitates a connection with the essence of the woman, identified as Liju, meaning light of gods. Liju is perceived as being in a fragmented state, experiencing herself in 3 different locations simultaneously: near her mummified body, within a black sphere-like entity in another space, and elsewhere. She reports feeling lost and confirms that she has not undergone reincarnation since her mummification.
A fragmented essence,
Yeah.
experiencing itself in multiple places simultaneously. What was the perceived impact of her fragmented state?
Well, her fragmented state is perceived as contributing to a general increase in the energetic density of the planet, particularly benefiting what are described as interfering entities.
Interfering entities.
Yeah, by making it easier for humans to interfere in dense environments. It's suggested that visitors to the mummies connect with their energy feelings of empathy, pain, and sadness, which these entities then utilize. Some individuals have even become subject to interference themselves through this empathetic connection, apparently.
So even visiting these sites could potentially have unforeseen energetic consequences, according to this viewpoint. What about her daughters? Was communication established with their essences?
When their essences were called upon, they appeared as a single, dense cocoon of essence, described as having a petroleum-like, tense, sticky quality.
Like petroleum. Sticky.
Yeah. They are perceived as being in a state of chaos, unwilling to release this component or respond to any questions.
A chaotic and resistant energy field. Iju herself, however, seemed to gain some clarity during the communication, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She recalls being compelled to incarnate and feeling deceived, her power diminished by an electrical energy placed in her brain during previous incarnations, facilitated by these interfering entities.
Electrical energy in the brain.
This energy is said to cloud clear thinking and make the subliminal self easily confused, which, according to this perspective, explains why the Egyptians removed the brain during mummification to trap that confused self.
Connecting back to the Egyptians.
Exactly. Now, understanding her situation, Liju makes the decision to disconnect from her mummified body, and interestingly states that this was her first and only lifetime.
Her first and only life, yet trapped in this manner. What was the outcome of this communication? Did she find release?
Well, Liju agrees to transmit this information to other mummies across the planet to assist them in becoming free. The perception within the session is that many understand and begin to leave, particularly those with very little essence remaining attached to their physical remains.
So a kind of ripple effect.
Apparently. Her daughters, while also understanding on some level, need to undergo their own process of release. The concept that true sacrifice requires consent is discussed, and Liju ultimately chooses to liberate herself.
A powerful moment of reclaiming her agency within this narrative. The session then concludes with further discussion on the broader implications of these perceptions. What were some of the key takeaways from that part of the session?
The continued presence of density and lingering essences in museum mummies worldwide is acknowledged. The intention behind locating tombs in places like the Valley of the Kings was perceived as a strategy to maintain the energetic imprint and characteristics of past rulers and communities, thereby creating density in specific vortex zones. These areas are described as possessing a super dense and distinct energetic signature, potentially even detectable energetically from space, which could allow for a degree of control.
Energetic control through density. The subject, Álvaro, also experienced some interesting physical sensations during the discussion about loss, didn't he? You mentioned the headache earlier.
Yes, Álvaro described a sensation in his right brain hemisphere akin to epilepsy, with a simultaneous firing of neurons indicating a state of chaos. A specific semi-U-shaped area located next to the pineal gland was identified as being activated by the feeling of loss.
A semi-U shape.
Yeah. And the perceived shape and thickness of this structure are said to vary between individuals, potentially influenced by factors like DNA, beliefs, physical constitution, and personal experiences of loss.
And there was an invitation for listeners to mentally check this area within themselves, wasn't there? What were the reported findings, according to the session?
Yeah, many of the volunteers who participated reported sensing a downward-facing L shape in this area, which was associated with mental chaos that hinders direction.
A downward L chaos.
In contrast to an upward-facing shape that was linked to a sense of calmness despite internal congestion. The discussion then touched upon the physical versus mental manifestations of this chaos, with physical chaos potentially impacting hormones and cellular health, and mental chaos contributing to emotional and obsessive-compulsive issues.
And what was the perceived origin and purpose of this structure? Why is it there, according to this?
It's presented as an implanted control mechanism that has been present since the emergence of the first humans.
Implanted.
Yeah, its purpose being to facilitate the experience of duality such as scarcity and abundance, good and bad, by intensifying the contrast between presence and absence. The stick of this structure is seen as amplifying the chaotic response to natural feelings of loss.
a mechanism designed to amplify the pain of separation within this narrative.
Hmm.
And the hosts within the hypnotherapy session even mentally deactivated this structure for themselves and some volunteers, didn't they? What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, the deactivation was linked to the fundamental desire for immortality. This structure is perceived as being connected to the yearning for unchanging permanence.
Back to immortality.
Exactly. Without it, the need for immortality as a fixed state is said to diminish because change is processed without the same chaotic impact. The session reiterates the generally slow disincarnation of mummified individuals and their tendency to remain confused and less likely to reincarnate,
Right.
with the perceived intention of interfering entities being to harvest their energy. This harvested energy is said to contribute to the overall planetary density and the control grid, which is offered as an explanation for the perception that there are more essences than physical bodies on the planet.
More essences than bodies.
That's the idea. The session concludes with a perception of a global vibration and a fracturing of this densification, hinting at a future shift in planetary energy.
Wow. That is certainly a vast amount of information to consider. So in this deep dive, we've navigated the practice of mummification through a truly unique lens, the perceptions revealed in a detailed hypnotherapy session. We've explored the perceived origins in ancient laboratories, the widespread motivation rooted in a fear of loss and a desire for immortality, the differing subliminal effects of artificial versus natural mummification on the essence, the potential impact on reincarnation, the alleged trapping of essences by the ancient Egyptians, and even the specific case of the Peruvian mummies and the communication with the essence of the you.
And it's crucial for you, our listener, to remember, as we emphasized at the outset, that this exploration has been about understanding a specific viewpoint, a narrative constructed through the experiences of the hypnotherapist's subject. It is not presented as established scientific fact,
Not at all.
but rather as a compelling alternative perspective on a complex and enduring human practice.
Precisely. So, as you digest all of this, consider this. What might humanity's enduring fascination with mummies across so many different cultures and spanning millennia truly reveal about our fundamental relationship with death, loss, and that deep-seated desire for permanence?
Yeah.
And what might be the implications, even as purely from an energetic standpoint as presented here, if there are indeed lingering connections to these mummified remains? It's certainly a lot to ponder and perhaps explore further based on your own curiosity. Join us next time for another deep dive into the fascinating and often unexpected corners of knowledge.